Oh, how is the weather with you today? It's awfully windy here.
It's not bad actually. I mean, I am in London, so yeah, it's a bit cloudy, but all right.
Not too bad. Not too bad.
Mm.
It's been a very strange May for weather-wise. I don't know what it's like with everyone else. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Good
Um,
morning.
I'm here with Simon Brett, the fabulous Simon Brett, who, if you're a Listening Books member, you may remember his previous interview, which we've realised is nearly 10 years ago now. So time has flown. But yeah, let us know. Say hi. I'm Claire from Listening Books. We're an audiobook charity for people who can't access printed books. And Simon is a fantastic author and writer. And he's very kindly joining us today to answer your questions and my questions. And we'll be talking about Major Bricket, which is his new novel, which I've just finished yesterday and I really enjoyed.
Oh, bless you.
It was a great book.
You will go far in the diplomatic service.
I'm angling for a job. I really enjoyed reading it. It's I just finished the Declutterer.
Oh yes,
Decluttering mysteries, which I found it quite different to that.
No, they are very different.
They are very different, but yeah, it was fantastic. If you do have any comments for Simon, please pop them in the chat. If not, you just want to enjoy listening, that's fine too. I'm just going to start by saying,
I would like to say it's very nice to be in a village hall, even if it's a virtual one, because we live very near to our village hall where we live, and all three of my children had their wedding receptions there after they were married.
Oh, really? Oh, lovely.
Yeah, so I have a great affection for village halls.
I do love a village hall. They are fantastic. Yeah. So I'm going to start with Major Bricket. I think, according to your website, it's your 120th book.
I think
right?
Technically, I think it's my 119th. I think the 120th comes in November, which is going to be a Mrs. Pargeter book, which is Mrs. Pargeter's Past. Yes.
Oh, that will be really interesting.
Yeah. So,
I mean, that's quite an achievement.
Well, I guess. I mean, I suppose if the first book had sold in huge numbers, there might not have been so many. But it's, I mean, I do actually, a lot of writers moan about being a writer and they say, oh, what purgatory it is. And I do actually rather like writing, and there's nothing I like better than, I mean, it's terrible when it's going badly, but when a book is going well and ideas are flooding in, then that's a really good feeling. I mean, you still go through terrible bits where you often get to a situation writing a book. I remember I once spent 2 days looking at the words chapter 23 because I knew what had happened in chapter 22 because I'd written it, and I knew what was going to happen in chapter 24, but could I get that bit that linked the two together? No. So but I mean, fortunately with me, the writing process is relatively short, so I get that agony for maybe 2 or 3 days, whereas people who take a year to write a book, there's what all writers I know, there's a kind of 2/3 sag, I think of it, where you get to a point where you've been working very hard and you're basically knackered actually, or you haven't planned the rest of it. And I ring writer friends and I say, oh, how's the book going? And they say, oh, it's terrible, I'm going to have to scrap this and start again. And I say, oh, how far through are you? And they say, oh, I suppose about 2/3. And I say, yeah. And almost everyone I know has that. And it's probably the same with any sort of major endeavor, that you have a burst of energy at the beginning and then there comes a kind of sag, and then you regenerate energy to get to the end of it.
How do you do that? How do you kind of kickstart the creative process again if you've been staring at
it's often something terribly basic. You've got the plot worked out to an extent, but you suddenly realize that there's I mean, in fact, I had one yesterday where there was sort of 2 plot in the. I'm writing another of the decluttering books at the moment, which you mentioned, and there were kind of 2 plots, and I was trying to prevent my character from having to zap back and forth to London on virtually a commuting basis. And I suddenly, I was stuck with this, and I suddenly had the thought, actually, I could engineer it so that the people she was going to see in London came down to Chichester to see her. I mean, it's terribly basic, but something like that, you can get snagged like that for a whole long time. You think, how she can't go back to London. I mean, she's been zapping back, and then you suddenly think, and it's just a terribly simple thing, but it suddenly makes everything a lot clearer. So, I mean, basically, you just keep looking at it, and you suddenly see, oh yes, that won't work. No, okay. I often think the sort of planning of a book, it's a bit like playing with Lego, and you've got all these little bits of your book which have to fit in somewhere. And it's a very basic kind of process that where you think, oh, well, if that's happened there, that must have happened there. And I always think of that as the Lego bit of planning. And then, I mean, the wonderful thing about being a writer, or so far, is that, you do suddenly get ideas from left field. You're working on something, and always starting a book, I find, is really quite difficult. And you make many more changes to the beginning of a book than you do to the end, because by the end you've sort of eliminated so many possibilities that there's only one thing that can happen, really. Whereas at the beginning, the possibilities are infinite in a way, and actually writing that first bit is tough. And then you get over the first bit and you think, I'm in the sunlit uplands, but of course you're not. You then you suddenly realise there's a vast, I mean, my books are quite short, but, there is this vast amount of book to be created, and that can be quite daunting.
Yeah, I suppose even if they physically end up being quite short, there's still a lot to think about and pack into.
And the difference between sort of being within one paragraph of the end and actually having written that paragraph is massive. Once you've got to the end, yes, it may all be rubbish, but it's retrievable rubbish, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
And I'm particularly with a crime novel, you've got so many sort of loose threads in your head. Oh, I've got to keep that plot going, and I haven't explained that she did that, and so you've got all this in your head, and you suddenly type the last sentence, and you can let them go. I mean, they're there, and they need tidying up and all that, but you are actually. So I'm hoping within the next week I will be in that situation with the book that I'm currently writing. It's actually due. It's due at the end of May. But I had
so you got a little bit of time.
No, I had a very encouraging letter from my editor yesterday, saying that she was going to be on holiday next week, so it wouldn't matter if a week later. Sure.
Yes, thankfully.
So I was very encouraged by that.
Oh, fantastic. So I'll just say a quick hello to everyone who said hello to us this morning. So hi, Amy, Hazel, Irene, everyone else that's there that doesn't want to say hello yet.
Hello to you all. Good morning.
Please do put your questions in the comments if you haven't. So let's kind of move on to Major Bricket. So he isn't your average amateur village sleuth.
Yeah.
He appears to have had, a clandestine career in his past.
Yes.
I think that's quite a refreshing difference in a village sleuth.
Yes, I mean, I thought so. And also, I mean, what I love about, I live in a very small village myself of about 200 souls. Actually, it was rather sweet when they did a millennium map. They put various bits of information, and they discovered that in the year 1800, our village had 200 inhabitants, and in the year 2000 it had 201. And so you're kind of looking around, who is it?
This is extra person.
I mean, what I love about villages is there's lots of gossip, and particularly now with WhatsApp and things like that, you know, we get endless things about potholes, and also there's a special WhatsApp for the trains, because everyone is very concerned about how the trains are working. And so, you know, you will discover over breakfast that there has been, you know, a trespasser on the line near Barnum, and everything is thrown into confusion, or a cow has escaped from a field. You know, it's very and I remember when we first moved from London to the country, which is over 40 years ago now, but you know, we'd had a very metropolitan life, and the first week we were in West Sussex, we got a copy of the West Sussex Gazette, which is a big local newspaper, and I remember there was a headline and it said, "Dead ducks, ferrets blamed." And I thought, yes, maybe we have moved away from the media world of London.
Oh, that's fantastic. Amy asked, how did your writing career start?
My writing career, I'd always wanted to write, and I never thought being a full-time writer was a realistic ambition. So I think I wrote my first full-length book when I was 17, and it was maybe 60,000 words long. And it took another 10 years or so to write 60,000 words that might interest someone else. You know, that was quite a big breakthrough. So I'd always wanted to. And when I was at university, well, when I was at school, actually, we had a house drama competition, and I wrote a rather serious Brechtian play called Mammon, which I directed, and which won the house drama competition. I was very chuffed. And in fact, I got my house colours for it. It was because it was a very, very sporty school, and you know, everyone got their house colours, sort of captain of rugby and this or cricket or something. But since I'd actually won the house drama competition, they couldn't help giving it. So I got mine for drama, you know. It's very sweet. And then I was at Oxford and did lots of drama and stuff there, and also wrote for reviews and went to the Edinburgh Festival, and you know, did a late night show, and well, 2 years running actually, and I'd written a lot of that. And so that, you know, I was always writing away. But then I got an offer to go to the BBC as a radio producer, well, a trainee radio producer straight out of university. And so I did that for 10 years, but I was still trying. I think I wrote at least, I think probably 3 other very properly unpublished books while I was doing the day job. And I loved being a producer. I mean, it was a radio producer. It was enormous fun. And then I moved to London Weekend Television as a producer there, and I didn't enjoy television nearly as much. It was a much slower medium, you know, a lot of sitting around. And also I'd by then had a couple of books published, and so I was sort of you know, starting to think I was making about as much money from my writing as I was from the day job. So I thought, now is the time to halve my income, like the day job. And it was, I mean, it was a risk actually at the time. You know, by then I think I was married and we had 2 small children. So, you know, and the gamble was really, would I write more doing it full time than I was doing in my spare time? Unfortunately, that seemed to work out. And although there have been many ups and downs, both creatively and financially, over the 40 plus years since, I do actually make my living from something that I think I would do anyway. You know, it's nice to be paid for it, but it was my hobby, and I kind of moved my hobby to the center of my life. And you know, it's a very, when it's going well, as I say, you feel, you know, it's a very privileged position.
It's a good thing.
When it's going badly, there's no one else to blame. It's completely. Yeah,
you're very reliant on yourself and your own.
Yeah, exactly.
Ability there, aren't you?
Yes.
Hazel would like to know who's your favourite character to write about. I'm not sure if this applies to Major Bricket specifically or yourself.
Well, Major Bricket, of course, this is the first Major Bricket book, so I'm kind of getting to know him. I mean, my first well, the first published book was about Charles Paris, the actor detective who is now on Radio 4 in the wonderful guise of Bill Nighy, who plays the part. And I guess he is the kind of personality closest to my own. I mean, his circumstances are very different from mine, but his attitudes to things are, you know, he has a kind of slight cynicism about the world, which I'm afraid I probably share. So he's, I think, the one closest to me. But the one I probably have most fun writing about is Mrs. Pargeter, who is, you know, she is a widow richly left, and it kind of becomes clear as her investigations go on that her deceased husband, well, wasn't always on the right side of the law, but she claims never to know anything about this. But she gets a lot of help from his former colleagues who have useful and varied skills, shall we say. So I've written a new one of those fairly recently, and in fact that I think will be my 200th book in November when that's published. Yep.
I felt like Major Bricket and Mrs. Pargeter, in terms of the style, I suppose, they felt very similar in that.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, you know, there are different levels of realism in my books, and I mean, I remember people used to say, "Oh, couldn't you get Charles Paris to meet Mrs. Pargeter in one of your books?" And I said, "No. I mean, they live in totally different universes. You know, Charles Paris is more or less realistic. I mean, you know, he's an actor, and he goes through the things that actors have to go through, and he's kind of a real character. Whereas Mrs. Pargeter is, you know, kind of Ealing comedy cloud cuckoo land, which is great fun to write about, but at a very different level of reality. And as you've observed, Major Bricket is much nearer that. You know, it is a kind of realistic setting, but the things that happen are not entirely realistic. So it's quite fun to vary those. And again, the decluttering series is a different level of reality again. You know, that is actually much more serious and sort of takes on board various issues like mental illness and that kind of thing. So I mean, that again is a very different background.
How do you source your ideas? Because obviously they are quite different in their styles. And as you say, declutter has a far more serious kind of undercurrent to it.
Yeah.
How do you source your ideas for those kind of different?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that there are so many is good, because I think if I finished one book and went straight on to another book about the same characters, I would find that very stultifying. And the fact that I can finish, I mean, as I say, I hope I'm near the end of the current decluttering book, and then the next one I'm going to write is another Major Bricket. So I mean, that'll be, you know, a whole clean slate, if you like, completely different attitude, completely different tone of voice, and that I find quite stimulating. But I mean, where the idea, actually, the decluttering one, if I were doing this interview from my home in Sussex, I could show you where the decluttering thing happened, because I'd be in my study, and about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, we had a leak in the roof. And in fact, my study is just next to, there's a Saxon rampart along our garden, and the other side of that is the village recreation ground and cricket pitch. Anyway, I got this leak coming through, and it was going on to my own file copies of my own books, so they would get, you know, which minor disaster. But I spent a couple of days, and I had been getting, you know, I've been very busy, and I'd just been kind of building shelves as new books came in, and that I built these kind of Heath Robinson shelves surrounding myself, and my filing was mostly on the floor. And my wife had noticed this, but I hadn't really, you know, in fact I couldn't really open the door of my study fully. I hadn't noticed. And so anyway, this leak prompted activity, and I spent a couple of days rather dispiritedly moving damp books into cardboard boxes and taking them through to the spare room. And then I went to London for a couple of days, and my wife realized I needed help. And so she went online to get local decluttering services. And she came across this wonderful woman called the Clutter Queen, whose real name is Nikki Sawkins. And she came, and she was just, she was just brilliant, because she wasn't there for many days, but she did sort of, and particularly, I've got 2 rooms where I work, and one we rather grandly called the library. And in the library, I had a very good reference section, complete Encyclopedia Britannica and that kind of thing. And she said, well, when did you last open one of these? And I realized now so much of that information is available online. Yeah. There were whole rafts of books that I literally hadn't opened for a decade. And so, and she was very good about, and she got all kinds of contacts, because the ceiling needed replacing, and it needed redecorating, and new shelves needed building and all that. So she had all these contacts. And one afternoon, we were sorting through some stuff in what we grandly call the library. And I said to her, sort of casually, I said, oh, have you ever come across a dead body while you've been decluttering? And she said, oh, yes. You see,
no, really.
And I thought, and in fact, what it was, because with her decluttering, as in fact with the character in the books, a lot of it is sort of after service, if you like. Somebody will have a problem, she'll sort it out, but she still keeps in touch with them to see that it hasn't, the hoarding hasn't come back, that kind of thing. And there was a guy she'd been seeing on a weekly basis for and one day she got there and he had died. So it wasn't her, but obviously the crime writer in me, my antennae are going, wow, just a minute, declutterer. She's given keys to a house, often working there on her own without the owners there, that kind of thing. And also, by definition, hoarding and things like that, there is a mental illness dimension to it. So it's going to be a house where there's some kind of problem. And I thought that'd be wonderful for a crime series. And so I told her that what I was thinking, and I remember my wife and I took her out for lunch, and she was wonderful with all these anecdotes about decluttering, and some of them were pretty ghastly, I have to confess. Hoarders who sort of bottled their bodily effluence, and I haven't gone that far in the books, but there's some pretty nasty stuff there. And anyway, so I was completely straight with her, and she said, no, that's fine. And then when I'd finished the book, I sent it to the Circus Corpse, was the first one, and I sent it to her to check through, and she was quite happy with it. And then there was a book launch, and she came to the book launch, and in fact, I remember that was just before lockdown started, so we had this launch, and I still stay in touch and will email her with questions. But the payoff was that, as I said, and one of the last things that happened in this remaking of my working area was the roofers went on the roof to find out what had actually caused the leak, and they found a tile which cracked like that, and in it was a cricket ball which had caused it. So as I said, we're next door to the cricket ground in the village, and somebody must have hit a 6, so it went over the Saxon rampart and broke the tile, and the water poured in. You see, so, and that person, they knew they'd scored a 6 because they'd have realised that, but they didn't know that they'd started a crime series.
A crime series.
which I thought, it's just wonderful. And it's very rarely that you can say exactly where an idea came from, but that one I certainly can.
It must have been nice having that kind of source material on your doorstep, as it were. It
was so much help, and she was, and it was also, she was very interesting about the sort of mental health aspect. She had done a cognitive behavioural therapy course, and there are, and I'm afraid it kind of, it came home to me a bit, because my brother died 2 years ago, and he had sort of cut himself off from the rest of the family. I hadn't seen him for 19 years, which was terrible. But I thought it was me, I thought I'd done something wrong. And then after his death, we discovered that he had sort of become a recluse. And it wasn't just us, he had shut himself off from everyone. And, he wouldn't let electricians into his house, although central heating hadn't worked for about 10 years. And, he wouldn't actually let anyone into his house, which was desperately sad. But I mean, it kind of brought this dimension of, the mental health side of hoarding back to me. So, there's a wonderful expression by an American comedian called Joe Ansis, who said, the only normal people are the ones you don't know very well.
I never really thought of it like that, but yeah, that's quite true.
Normality, I mean, what is normal? We've all got our strange little quirks, and I mean, it's like I was thinking yesterday, the thing that always happens in crime novels and television things. They say he was showing bizarre behaviour as he approached the scene of the crime. He was walking back and forth, looking in shop windows. Well, what do we all do if we're early for an appointment? If we pride ourselves on being on time for everything, we almost get there early, and we spend 10 minutes walking up and down looking in shop windows. There's nothing sinister about it, but it kind of amuses me when, and that sort of thing where they, if you were asked, what were you doing on May the 7th, you'd, May the 7th, God, what day of the week was that? Well, and in a crime novel or a television, you would immediately become a suspect. Did you notice she claimed not to remember what she was doing on May the 7th? None of us can remember what we were doing on May the 7th. I mean, we may, if we actually focus, we can think, oh, yes, it was I'm trying to think what I was doing on May the 7th. I was in Spain, actually, with my daughter, yes, and my wife. Yes, that was very nice. I had a very good May, now I think of it. I'll probably tell you what we have for lunch too, but and that's always, the investigating detective will leap on this inconsistency. You say May the 7th, I was, and you get it wrong, and then you say no, actually, it's always these are giveaways in crime fiction.
Yeah, especially I think in Major Bricket, because you've got so many village characters, and they've all got their ideas and kind of peppering it with clues, red herrings, opinions. And then he has to kind of decipher.
That's part of the game. I mean, there's I think particularly in humorous crime fiction, you're sort of playing with the genre, and there are little jokes at the expense, which, I mean, they're not integral, but real people who read a lot of crime fiction will pick up. I mean, for instance, we're not going to have a spoiler, but the last line of the Major Bricket is a sort of in-joke for crime readers. So you could do that kind of thing, and I quite like doing that, because it's people, they just respond, and it doesn't matter if they miss it, but it's a nice little in-joke.
It is, and it is funny as well, which is nice. As you say, Declutter is more serious, and Pargeter and this series is this. There are little in jokes which are funny. I love the Viscount, and kind of the whole thing at the end. I don't know how to describe it without giving it away. They realise some things. At the end.
I mean, I think there's a whole sort of tradition of humour in crime fiction, and in fact, there was a big crime convention a couple of weeks ago in Bristol called Crime Fest, and I was on a panel with other writers of humorous crime fiction, and it was quite interesting. I mean, there are certain things, you can't make the murder too sort of personal. You have to have a victim who doesn't matter that much. I mean, if in the real world, obviously everyone matters, but in a humorous crime novel, you can't have a victim who is too sympathetic, who we care about too much, because that triggers a whole lot of other emotions which you don't want. And in fact, I mean, quite a lot of the so-called golden age crime fiction, they were quite funny. I mean, Dorothy L. Sayers in a book like Murder Must Advertise, very funny send up of the advertising business, and quite a lot of Agatha Christie. You know, there are very good little jokes in there. And I was just reminded, thinking of Agatha Christie, that my daughter, who is now 50, but when she was about 12, I guess, she read her first adult book, and she came bouncing downstairs, said, "Oh, I just read this really good book. It's by someone called Agatha Christie, and it's called Lord Edgware Dies." And she'd never heard the word Edgware spoken out loud. I just thought it was very sweet. And she showed faces. No, so I mean, it's quite nice that you can, you know, you're talking to the, and also cozy crime, as it's called, is, well, thanks to Mr. Osman, is having a great success at the moment. And I've been writing cozy crime for over 40 years. And, you know, if I go to the States, I find I'm on the shelf. British cozy, which I'm fine with that, you know. But cozy does mean what you were saying, that, you know, there's not too much blood and brains on the wall. The murder is a kind of, it's like a key that starts up a little clockwork toy, really. But
it's the puzzle element to it, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, the puzzle is, I mean, I'm quite old-fashioned because I'm still really writing traditional whodunits, and there are very few crime writers now doing that because it's moved on. And I think the reasons for that were kind of, you know, the golden age where the puzzle was everything. Most of the good puzzles have been done by the time, you know, and then you get the Second World War where, you know, joking about death suddenly becomes a bit, you know, almost every family knows of, if, you know, it might be a family member who's died, but they know that someone who's been bereaved by the war and that. And so and crime fiction could have gone in various different ways. And a lot of it went to a much greater realism, which is, I mean, wonderful. There's some great writers out there. And actually at this same convention in Bristol, we have a Ghost of Honour slot. And the Ghost of Honour is a distinguished crime writer who has sadly left us. And I did, I moderate these, and I did John le Carré this time with two of his sons and his daughter-in-law. So, I mean, that was just fascinating to get him talking about him, because, I mean, he was such a major figure in terms of changing crime fiction, and also all that wonderful stuff in the, you know, about moles and lamplighters and babysitters and all that sort of spy language. He created all of it. I mean, we've now got to the point where some of it we don't know what's real and what, but apparently he did create all of it himself, and he had enormous pleasure sort of foisting these expressions on the great world public. So, and he came across as, you know, quite a man with a good sense of humor as well, but I mean, obviously a very, very distinguished writer. So, I mean, I think that's what appeals to me about crime writing, is there is now such a spread. I mean, there are so many different people writing crime fiction, and it also means that when you meet with other crime writers, they haven't got the same career pattern at all. You know, everyone comes from somewhere different, so they're always lively people to talk to. And also, I think if you spend your days killing people, you can be pleasant to them in your spare time. I mean, we hear these terrible stories of how the romantic novelists are always at each other's throats and having feuds and flouncings and that kind of thing. Whereas you never hear that with crime writers. You know, a very benign group of people.
Get it all out on the page. Hazel would like to know who your favourite author is.
Well, my favourite author in the crime genre would have to be Raymond Chandler, just because of the quality of his writing. You know, I mean, Raymond Chandler is kind of, because crime fiction, one of the sort of accepted wisdoms is that the plot is paramount. And he couldn't do plots to save his life. You know, his plots, if you try to follow the plot of one of his books, complete gobblers. But the quality of the writing is just so good that, you know, it carries you through. If something's well written, you don't lose your critical judgment, but you will accept anything they tell you is happening because you're so enjoying the writing. So, I mean, he in crime fiction, in other forms of fiction, I guess my favourites would be Jane Austen, yes, predictably enough, Evelyn Waugh and P.G. Wodehouse. And the Jane Austen, Chandler, Austen, and Waugh, it's all because of their economy and the way they use humour to do something more than just be funny. You know, they're very precise. And Wodehouse, just because, I mean, the sheer imagination and the playing with the... I never got on with Wodehouse until I was about 40, and suddenly I got all these wonderful books to read. And I mean, some of his one-liners, I always remember there's one where... And I speak as someone who had a very good dinner last night. And there was a man who had an even better dinner than I had, and was basically drunk. And the Wodehouse line was, he got into bed the second time it came around, which I just think is wonderful. You know, I wish I'd invented that line. I just think it's so good.
I think there are some books you appreciate more at different stages of your life.
Yes, and some you also, you know, you have a very different reaction to at different stages of your life.
Yeah.
I mean, I try not to reread much just because Anno Domini tells me that there are a lot of books out there that I haven't read once, let alone twice. But no, you do, you know, and something which you thought was wonderful, you can get very... I mean, it also happens that something that is mold breaking gets imitated and imitated. You know, so sort of 20 years later, when you read the original, it seems a bit tired and hackneyed, but it's simply because so many people since have copied it. So, I mean, and sometimes it happens in an author's lifetime. I mean, Hemingway, you know, very definitely changed the way, well, he changed how writing was done because, you know, much shorter sentences, very sharp, very clear. But towards the end of his life, across the road and into the trees, I think it was one of his last books. I mean, it reads like a Hemingway parody because he wrote it, but I mean, so many other people were doing that style that he'd almost, you know, he'd outlived his own revolutionary qualities, which was not something I'm worried about.
So with Major Bricket, you actually narrate this book yourself.
Oh, yes, yes.
Was that your choice?
I love it. I mean, I've narrated almost all of my books now. I remember the first time they asked me to do it. It was one of the early Charles Paris's, and it was about 12 years after I'd written the book. And I thought I was a better writer by then, and I kept trying to improve the sentences as I read it, and the producer would put down the talkback key and say, could we have the text as printed, please? And I said, look, I wrote it. Could we have the text as printed? So, but I mean, now I know I'm going to do it. You know, when I write a book, I know I'm going to have to read it as well. I mean, it's very good I mean, I think all writers should read what they've written out loud anyway, because you just hear little sort of, not the same words, but echoes of words which sound clumsy, words that rhyme in the middle of sentences that just are awkward. So, but with me, there's another incentive because I know I'm going to have to sit in the studio and read it. And since I've been doing that, it's very striking that certain people don't appear in my books. There are no Georges, no one from Liverpool, no one from Birmingham, because I can't do the accents. Oh, and no one from Northern Ireland, you see. So I can actually get ahead of myself by not including voices I can't do. But it's very strange because I remember in one of the Charles Paris's, I actually had him, he was recording an audiobook, you see. And well, you know about audio, and you know that when you're broadcasting, I mean, the things that worry you well, it might be what you're going to say, but if you're doing a book, you've got the script in front of you, so that's not a problem. but we worry about little inadvertent noises that our body might make, like stomach grumbles and things, you see. And I know a lot of people who read audio, and no one's really got the perfect method for stopping stomach grumbles. I mean, some people eat a banana and some have a biscuit, and some hold a cushion in front of their stomach with a microphone. Anyway, I was writing this book about Charles Paris recording an audiobook, and he mentioned these worries that we have, and Charles Paris in the book hears his stomach starting to go into the third cycle of a washing machine, you see. And as I'm sitting in the studio recording this, my stomach goes into the third cycle of a dishwasher, or a washing machine. So, it's a very odd experience, really. And it also, I mean, say I take 4 months to write a book, something like that. You read it in a day and a half. And so you get all these strange little reminders. You get to the end of the chapter and you think, oh God, that's when we had to get someone to sort out the central heating. There are these little things that you've experienced, and you're going in a tiny microcosm of the whole thing, and you think, oh, I remember that. Yes. And also, interestingly, the sentences you stumble over, well, the sentences I stumble over, are the ones I never quite got right in the first place. Lines I've rewritten a few times because something was wrong. And when I'm reading them, I find that's where I stumble. Yeah, which, because it didn't feel natural and still doesn't.
It is not quite right. Amy would like to know, are there any parallels in being a producer for radio and TV that you have found with writing novels?
That's very interesting. A good question. I think I learned a lot when I was a radio and television producer. I learned a lot about editing. I learned a lot. I got quite good at editing other people's scripts because that was the job. And you sort of think, oh yes, no, that scene's too long. And if we move that little bit up there, then it's going to be clearer towards the end. And I do find that, I was a comedy producer, and comedy and crime I find are very similar in the way that you plan it. And, if you think, a lot of what I was saying about the Lego bit, a good joke has to have the setup has to be right so that we get the turnaround at the end. And in a lot of crime fiction, you will have an interview, the investigator and a suspect or something, and it's all going along a certain line. And then at the end, the investigator asks a completely left field question, and the person being interrogated gives an unexpected answer, which is the plot point. And that's just how a joke works. And I remember my sister once bounced up to me and she said, oh, I've just heard this wonderful joke about the lunch pack of Notre Dame. And I said, oh, how does it go? And she said, well, said, this will kill you. She said, what is wrapped in cellophane and swings from a steeple? And I said, amaze me. She said, well, it's the lunch pack of Notre Dame. Now, that is a very good example of the wrong way of controlling the flow of information. And writing is all about controlling the flow of information, particularly crime fiction. What do you want the reader to think at this point? And sometimes I'll get to the end of a chapter and I think, we haven't advanced much further in the sort of crime bit of it. And I will just put in a little paragraph at the end that points suspicion to another character. Probably totally irrelevant to the plot, but it's just kind of keep your readers on tenterhooks. So, that's another possibility. It's a game you're playing with the readers, but it's quite a fun game, and hopefully both you and the readers enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think you do that really well in Major Bricket. At different points, I was going, oh, maybe it's this person.
Well, yes.
And then you get something else. And you go, oh no, that can't be.
Well, you're the perfect reader. I would like you to read all my books.
I do, so it's fine.
Need people like you.
So let's talk briefly about Charles Paris, because that has been revived for radio with Bill Nighy, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
but Jeremy France updated it as well, because obviously
yes.
Charles Paris, I think you wrote those in the 1970s, 80s.
Oh, I mean, the first one, well, my first published book was 1975, and that was the first Charles Paris, and I wrote one a year for the next 10 years. So, I mean, I have come back to him in recent years, but, you know, the early ones quite a long time ago. And when I was writing them, I was still, well, when I started, I was still employed, you know, as a producer. And so I had to do no research at all, because every time I picked up the phone, it was an actor or a director or a set designer, or, you know, I was in the theatre world. And then I had to, you know, once I gave up the day job, I had to do more research. And and my favourite method of research is, if I haven't done something myself, take out for lunch somebody who has, and just pick their brains. Because a lot of, you know, the more you become a writer, the more you sit behind a keyboard on the screen all day, the less actual interplay of real life you have. So, I mean, things like what happens in an office, you know, I haven't been in, well, I mean, I've been in other people's offices, but I haven't worked in an office for over 40 years. So, and over lunch, people relax, and they'll, you know, and stuff that, I mean, I don't know how your day starts when you come into work, but I mean, and it probably doesn't seem very important to you because you do it so often. But for a writer who knows nothing about it, it's absolutely invaluable, you know, the sequence of events. And also you discover wonderfully. I remember when I was writing a Charles Paris about a television game show, which was inevitably called Dead Giveaway. And I remember that a friend of mine in radio had just, her PA had just moved to television to work on the Generation game. And this was first time around, with Bruce Forsyth wearing his own hair. I mean, you know, it's quite a long time ago. And anyway, I took this girl out for lunch. Her name's Jo, I remember, and just asked, you know, how do people become contestants? And this is way before email. And she said, oh, they'll write a letter to the production office and say they think they'd be suitable, and then they'll get a form to fill in where they have to, you know, give their age and family background and all that, and hilarious things that happened on their honeymoon, so that Brucey can say, I believe all that. And at that point, they also had to send what was then a Polaroid photograph, you see, of themselves. And television was based then, and possibly now, on the fallacy that everyone is attractive. And this girl, the researcher, they said in the researcher's office, they had a wall which they called the ugly wall, on which they stuck all the Polaroid photographs of the people they thought were physically disqualified from appearing on the programme. And I thought that was so
That's
cruel.
so cruel.
Absolutely typical of the values of television, that I mean, it went straight in the book. And something like that, you know, as a writer, you was constantly projecting, and you were trying to think what would happen in a certain situation. But something like that, I could never have thought of. You know, I had to actually talk to someone who did the job, and she told me that. And I mean, that kind of stuff is wonderful. And in fact, I also, when I was writing Death Under the Dryer, you'll never guess where that was set, I took out for lunch the woman who ran the hairdressing salon where I had my hair cut, and the girl who actually cut my hair, who's called Diva, Lithuanian, who cut it yesterday, actually. We're still in touch. And I just picked their brains about, you know, what they did first thing when they get into the salon, what kind of clients were most difficult, you know, all this stuff which they didn't think was important. But for me, and they told me this wonderful thing, which never occurred to me, and in fact I couldn't use in the book, but they said a lot of people think they're left-handed because they always see them in the mirror. And that had just never occurred to me.
Oh.
But
no, I would have never.
No. So, I mean, things like that were, and in fact, Diva, who, as I say, I saw yesterday, you know, I'll quite often go in and she'll say, oh, I thought of another way of killing someone in a hairdresser's. But I mean, it's and also it gets you out of the house, because that's another thing with writing, you know, unless you actually positively make excursions, there's nothing to take you away from your keyboard.
Do you think, because you live in such a small a small village, do you think at some point you'll have kind of used everybody as a character?
I'd like to think I haven't actually used. I mean, I don't use real people. Real people give me ideas, but you know that we all. I mean, we all, you know, on public transport and things like that, you look at the person opposite and you, what they're reading or whatever, and you kind of form a little, you make a little backstory for them. Well, as a writer, that's part of your job, you know, and I'm sure you get it wrong, but you know, you're sitting opposite someone on the tube, and it's a girl looking very smart, and she's got a fleck of emulsion on her glasses, and you think, she's redecorating the new flat, you know, the one she moved to in London after she broke up with Julian in Birmingham. And, you know, she hasn't given him her new mobile number because it's a total cut-off, and she doesn't realise that the emulsion is there because, in fact, what she's going to do is she's going to a job interview for the new job that is going to, you know, reform her life. And, you've done all that. It's complete fabrication, but we all do it to some extent. But as I say, for writers, that's, you know, that's work.
I'm just having a quick look at the time. If anyone's got any more questions, please post them. We've got about 10 minutes left. So you mentioned that you've got another Decluttering Mysteries novel coming.
Yes.
Would you revisit any of your other series, or does there come a point where it doesn't make sense to do that?
I mean, I think that, assuming I get the Major Bricket, the second Major Bricket done in the time allotted, that will be the end of my commissioned work. So, I mean, hopefully they will still want me to write more books, but I'll then have to think about, you know, which, I mean, I'd certainly love to do another Mrs. Pargeter. I'd like to do another Fethering mystery, which we haven't actually mentioned, which is set locally. And it's quite funny because, you know, you set something locally and local people have, you know, they are interested. And I remember a friend of mine, when I wrote, I think it was Death on the Downs, and it was set in a little village on the Downs. And she said to me, oh, I was pretty sure I knew which village you meant, but you said that the nearest train station was Barnham and the nearest train station is Arundel. And I said, look, I'm a writer. I make things up. That's what we do. But I mean, people do like to be very specific. And there was another one I remember where in one of them I'd got some characters in the village who'd done a very tasteless barn conversion. You know, they put all kinds of little curlicues and things on it to make it look rather twee. And obviously they were being sent up in the book. And someone in the village said to me, "Oh, was that a reference to, you know, named a couple with a barn conversion?" And I said, "God, no, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't do that." And she said, "Oh, they will be disappointed."
Oh, I suppose people want to see themselves in
I guess they do. I guess they do. And I remember another thing, living in a small village. I tend to walk around the village in the morning. You know, it's a sort of just over a mile, quite hilly, and, you know, good walk. And when you meet someone at that time of day, you just, you know, sort of quick nod and nice day or whatever. And I remember that this was quite a long time ago, but I met one of our neighbours. You know, we just nodded politely to each other. And I saw her later in the day, in the village pub, which is at the end of our garden, which is wonderfully handy. And she said, "Oh, I saw you having your walk this morning, Simon, but I didn't like to say anything because I thought you might be thinking." Which I just think is so wonderful. You know, the writer in his carapace of thought cannot be interrupted. I mean, most people don't realise, I mean, don't understand what writers do, really. I heard a lovely story from another writer. We were talking about where we worked, and he said he works, he has an allotment, and he's got a shed on the allotment, and he goes there at 8 o'clock in the morning with his laptop, and he works away in the shed until 12. and then he goes home. And he says, there are other people on the allotment every day, same people. No one's ever asked him, what he's doing. But he said, where else can you get an office for 20 quid a year? It was rather sweet.
This is probably quite a good place to write, actually. I mean, quiet and lack of disruption.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit cold in the winter.
Oh, yeah. But you can get a little heat, I would think. Be all right.
We mentioned briefly about the radio shows that you've done, and you enjoyed that more. And obviously, you've written Major Bricket in it, and it's become an audiobook. Would you ever go the other way and kind of adapt, After Henry into a book, or would it not work?
I actually did that. I mean, when it was at its peak, and it was running on television, and it was in the top 10 viewing figures. I wrote a book for Penguin, which was actually called After Henry. Yeah. So I mean, we're talking 1980s, I think. So it's quite a while ago. But I was thinking with, and this will amuse you or not, according to where you were brought up, but with After Henry, when it started on radio and then transferred to television. And on radio, it hadn't had a studio audience. And I much prefer writing without a studio audience, because you can write sort of speech rhythms, natural speech rhythms, whereas with an audience, you always have to make sure you get, the joke words, the end of the line, that kind of thing. And I argued with the producer, argued, and this is, long before The Office or any of those big successes without audiences. And he said, eventually, Simon, it's all right for us down here, but you have to remember that north of Watford, if they don't hear people laughing, they don't know it's funny. My wife, who was brought up in Leeds, was less than amused by that.
I can imagine that. Yeah. I really like After Henry. If anyone listens to BBC 4 Radio 4 Extra.
4 Extra, yes. They're very...
You can re-listen to some of these. They're fantastic. So kind of finally, what is next for Major Bricket? He's kind of established himself again in the village after being away
that's
for
a very
a while.
good question. I've just been asked by the publisher where the synopsis is, and the synopsis is
Still writing.
I think it's going to be the village church. I think that's where the corpse will be found. I think it's going to be Major Bricket and the church corpse, and that's as far as I've got. But I'm hoping something will emerge. But I mean, it's interesting because with a new series, it's more difficult because you're finding your way with the characters, and I'm quite looking forward to it now. But it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I think, and then also remembering where they've been, but you haven't really got all of that. Say you have with Mrs. Pargeter.
No,
that backstory
exactly.
to draw on. So
and the Fetherings. I mean, I've now written 22 Fethering mysteries, I think, and you sort of get an accretion of new characters as you go along, and you find out more about the main characters and that kind of thing. And I always think writing a series, it's a bit like going to a party where a couple of people who will introduce you to other people, as opposed to just standing there with your warm white wine looking lost. So it's, it's more familiar. So yeah. I like that. But I hope I'll get there with Major Bricket. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous at my age to be starting a new series. It's the old don't buy green bananas thing. Here you go.
No, just keep going. It's great.
Oh, yes, that's the plan.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, no, it's been delightful, Claire, and thank you for being such a very good conversation. It's been
thank you. Well, I mean, it's all you.
And thank you to everyone in the village hall sitting there on their bales of hay.
Paying attention. Thank you so much for those who've asked your questions. They've been fantastic. If you do have an illness, disability, learning difficulty, or mental health condition, and would like to access our audiobooks, please do visit our website. The information will pop up in a moment. Again, we've got lots of Simon Brett books available for you to try, and hopefully more Major Bricket to come. And also visit his website as well, which will pop up at the end too. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Simon, for being a wonderful guest.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. It's been great fun. Thank you.
Thanks. See you later, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.